The American Civil War has fascinated and horrified people since its eruption 163 years ago. Whether you were left or right, northern or southern, the war affected everyone. It was brother against brother. America became so divided that we started a civil war, and over 600,000 Americans were killed in just 4 years. We have made videos in a few POW camps, Andersonville in Georgia, which had the highest death toll in the South, and Elmira Prison in New York, the highest in the North. Today we will go over Camp Douglas in Chicago, Illinois. Camp Douglas was built at the start of the war in 1861. After the firing on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days to put down the rebellion. After this failed, more and more volunteers were called for. It was up to the states and local governments to sign up the men, organize and equip them until later on in 1861 when the federal government took over. The buildings in Chicago that were used to house these volunteers had been filled up, so a makeshift camp was set up on the edge of the city. Eventually, this camp would be turned into Camp Douglas. The site was around 60 acres. Senator Stephen Douglas had owned some of the land that was donated to build the camp, and the camp was named after him. But the majority of the land donated was owned by Henry Graves. He had donated around 30 acres, and his home actually bordered on the site. Camp Douglas was established as a Union training facility. It was nearby Chicago, close to the railroad and close to Lake Michigan. These details made it a good location to build the camp, but it proved to be a less than ideal place for a camp. It was built in a low-lying area, so the ground was often wet and flooded. Militia troops were used to build the camp's barracks, but after the barracks were completed, the militiamen claimed that they were not paid what they were promised, and they mutinied. Regular troops had to regain control, and the militiamen were forced to fix the damage that they had caused. The camp would be one of the largest training camps for the Union Army. It housed thousands of men from Illinois and the surrounding states. The main entrance to the camp was on Cottage Grove Avenue. The barracks were wooden and built on the ground initially. They were 24 by 90 feet. They were supposed to house 90 men. The troops' training included daily drills, formations, marching, and weapons training. Many of the soldiers had little to no military experience. They were taught discipline. The men were given daily chores and had inspections often. Many of the men were from rural areas and had never left their small farming communities before. These men were now with thousands of men in tight quarters. Most of them had never been exposed to infectious diseases that were common in urban areas. Disease spread throughout the camp, and some of the men died. Pneumonia, smallpox, measles, malaria, dysentery, typhoid fever, they were all common illnesses in the Civil War camps. Disease would be by far the #1 killer during the Civil War. The men trained here were sent to battlefields in the eastern and western theaters. Between 20 to 40,000 troops went through Camp Douglas and then off to fight across America. Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee captured Fort Donelson in February 1862. This would be the first major Union victory in the Civil War. The Union Army laid siege to Fort Donelson, and after several days of fighting, the Confederate garrison was surrounded. The fort had around 12 to 15,000 men inside. Confederate General Simon Buckner was in charge after his superiors fled the fort. He sent a note to General Grant to discuss terms. Buckner received a response from Grant, which would go down in history. Yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. The media will give the name Unconditional Surrender Grant. The men inside Fort Donelson would now become prisoners, and the Federals did not know what to do with them. Around 4,500 of them would be the first to arrive at Camp Douglas. The camp was just that, a camp. It was not a prison. So when the prisoners arrived, they did not know how to house them. About 7,000 men from Camp Donelson would end up at Camp Douglas, from the 12 to 15,000 Confederates captured. When the Confederates arrived, most were poorly dressed. Some even arrived without shoes. The temperatures that day were in the mid-20s. At first, the Confederate prisoners and the Union troops about to leave the camp were housed together. They lived together for a few days until the troops were sent off to fight. A few days later, Confederate officers were transferred, and Camp Douglas was turned into an enlisted POW camp. After the Confederate victory at the Battle of Harper's Ferry in 1862, thousands of Unions had been captured and paroled. But under the terms set by Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, these parolees had to wait in camp until they could be formally exchanged. Thousands of them were sent to Camp Douglas in September of 1862. The men were forced to live in the same conditions as the Confederate prisoners. A year had passed after the camp's construction, and conditions had become bad. Brigadier General Tyler took over command of the camp from Colonel Tucker. Things got so bad that the Union soldiers began rioting and setting fires in the camp. General Tyler quelled the riots with active troops who were able to calm the men. Secretary of War Edward Stanton even ordered General Tyler to go easy on the Union parolees. The prison camps across America early on in the war were meant to hold prisoners for around 10 days, until a prisoner exchange could be negotiated. Enlisted men were traded usually man for man, and a set number of enlisted men were traded for officers. These prisoner exchanges made it so both sides did not have to hold thousands of prisoners. In March of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was formed. It was the first African American regiment. It was part of the United States Colored Troops. African American troops began fighting the Confederates. But in May of 1863, the Confederate Congress decided that any African American troops captured would be treated as fugitive slaves and returned to their original owners. The Confederate Army would not use any African American soldiers in prisoner exchanges. This backfired and put a halt on all prisoner exchanges. President Abraham Lincoln issued General Orders 252. These orders suspended prisoner exchanges until African American soldiers were treated the same as white soldiers by the Confederates, but they refused. Men on both sides would now be captured in the hundreds and even thousands. The North and the South did not have large prisons to hold tens of thousands of prisoners. Prisoners began to spring up across the North and South, but Camp Douglas had been housing prisoners since 1861. In the fall, the ground turned into a muddy mess. Now thousands of more prisoners would be forced into the camp. Private William Huff wrote a diary about his stay at Camp Douglas. These are a few of his entries. October 4th, 1863, arrived at Camp Douglas. The day was very cold and we were kept standing in the open square for about 4 hours. We had nothing to eat for 2 days. We are guarded by the Michigan sharpshooters, and sharpshooters they are, for they practice often on some of us and shoot in the barracks if the lights are not out, punctually at 9 o'clock. November 11th, the barracks occupied by the Yankees caught fire today, and a large portion of them were destroyed. We were all ordered to our quarters. The fire created quite an excitement among both Federals and prisoners. The evening paper contained the following report of the fire. Camp Douglas is on fire and the prisoners escaping. No such luck happened. One of the features of Camp Douglas is the brokers who deal in almost everything. They buy and sell Confederate money, greenbacks, and sutler tickets, and the sutler store is crowded from morning until night. January 1st, 1864. Every Confederate prisoner will remember this day. I'm going to headquarters to report I had my nose, ears, and chin frozen this morning. Frost was on the rafters and planks on the roof, and some places icicles of 2 inches hung down. This was caused by the breath congealing and freezing to the roof. It was all we could do not only to keep warm, but to keep from freezing. The guards even were frozen on the fence and had to be relieved every half hour. June 1864. It is rather difficult to escape, but now and then some fellow is lucky enough to do so. Several of my old companions have gone to another barrack, and my only way of passing time is with my pencil and guitar. But it is hard to get strings, so I use my pencil more than my music. They have taken our cooking vessels from us, and instituted kitchens, and shortened our rations, giving us nothing but pork and bread, and not quite enough of that. I do not mean fresh pork, oh no, but salt pickled pork, old and fat, and not water enough to wash it down. It is rather tough living, but we have to stand it. I think if the commissioner were here for a week, they would agree on an exchange. Private William Huff. In February of 1863, the temperatures plummeted to as low as 20 below zero. There were almost 4,000 prisoners behind the walls of Camp Douglas this month. Men from all over the South. Some men from Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They had rarely felt temperatures below freezing in their states. Now they were forced into these thin wooden barracks with little insulation, in frigid weather with little clothing. The death rate was the worst that month. 387 dead out of 3,884 prisoners. Disease was rampant, plus the sewers could not accommodate so many men, so dysentery spread throughout the camp. Many escaped from Camp Douglas. Some were recaptured, others made their way back to Confederate lines, and others just went home. The barracks were raised off of the ground to prevent tunneling. On one occasion, a tunnel was discovered under a barracks. The men were forced to stand in a line, and the guards were ordered to shoot any man that sat down. 3 were shot, and 1 died. The men who dug the tunnel confessed and were sent to the dungeon. The White Oak Dungeon was an underground, small 18-square-foot room with a hatch in the ceiling that led to the guard room as the only entry point, and a small window with bars for light. The space was dark, poorly ventilated, and damp. Prisoners confined there were subjected to minimal rations, sometimes only bread and water. Dozens of men could be forced into the dungeon at a time. It was said that the dungeon had a horrible stench, which escaped through the window and through the guard room. There were other forms of punishment at the camp. Men were hung by the thumbs. They were forced to stand on a barrel. They had signs hung off of them. Bucking and gagging. The men's hands were tied together in front of them, and then they were bent over with the knees against their chest, while a stick was put between their arms and legs to immobilize them. Men were forced to sit on a wooden horse for long periods of time. These forms of corporal punishment were also inflicted on the Union troops, depending on their crimes or infractions in the field. Over 500 of Morgan's raiders were sent to Camp Douglas after being captured trying to cross into West Virginia from Ohio. They were caught crossing the Ohio River. Morgan's men had many escape attempts while at Camp Douglas. On one occasion, 100 men had escaped into Chicago through the tunnels. Most were recaptured. Many underage prisoners were held at Camp Douglas, some as young as 14, but the Army refused to release them. On New Year's Day, 1864, the same day that Private William Huff described in his diary, some prisoners managed to escape that day, but the temperature was negative 18 degrees and a blizzard had hit. Some of the men froze to death while trying to escape. They were found later on. There was a supposed conspiracy to free the prisoners at Camp Douglas in 1864, but some historians believe that the plot never really happened. The plot was supposedly led by Confederate agents in Canada and some members of the Sons of Liberty. The plan was to have a mass breakout of Camp Douglas with help from Confederate sympathizers in Chicago. Weapons would be given to the prisoners after they had escaped, and a series of attacks would follow across the Midwest. But there is much debate about how far the plan actually went. Colonel Sweet, commander of the camp, believed the plot was real, and arrests were made, but many were released. Colonel Sweet was also known for the use of punishments and ration cutting while in command. He banned candles to try and stop tunneling, and he had the prisoners searched every day for contraband. But he also did a lot to try and improve the camp and have the prisoners kept clean. When word reached Washington about the horrors of Andersonville, D.C. officials ordered rations to be cut for the Confederate prisoners. Camp Douglas was often compared to Andersonville for the deaths and diseases, but there were big differences. The South by this point could barely feed its own people. Mass inflation raised prices to unbelievable numbers. The Anaconda Plan had blocked supplies from reaching the South. The North did not have these problems and could have easily fed the Confederate prisoners. It was in retaliation. That is why the prisoners' rations were cut. At Andersonville, the guards' own rations were cut multiple times, and they were close to starving themselves. There was not really any excuse in the North. Andersonville was much different. Prisoners at Andersonville were put into a 40-acre open field with a stream flowing through the middle, and not much else was there. They were not given shelter. The men used clothes and blankets or whatever they could find to build tents or shelters. At Camp Douglas, there was over 100 buildings. The camp was built originally for Union troops. A month after the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, most of the prisoners were released from Camp Douglas. First, they were asked to sign the Oath of Allegiance. Around 1,700 refused to sign the allegiance, and they were not given transportation home. A few months later, only the sick remained at the camp. Camp Douglas had seen 20,000 to 40,000 prisoners walk through its gates during the war. Estimates range that between 4,000 to 7,000 died at the camp, and it had a death rate at around 17%. Elmira Prison Camp had a death rate of 24%. It had 12,000 prisoners, and around 3,000 died. Andersonville had a death rate at around 29%. 45,000 prisoners were held at Andersonville, and around 13,000 died. Civil War prison camps were all horrible. Men suffered from diseases, starvation, and torture. It's not talked about nearly enough. The famous glorious battles get the headlines. The sufferings of Americans on both sides needs to be remembered. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.